and the rest. So not to say they're perfect, but I think there's a good story to tell there. Where we have not delivered as effectively is on grid infrastructure, on planning and on speed, and you've heard ad infinitum from all of us about plans for workers, plans for skills and wider economic questions in terms of manufacturing and industry. In Scotland, just without question, there is huge potential for Scotland. You've got wave and wind and tidal resource coming out of your ears north of the border. That's a very good thing. How the Scottish Government chooses to deploy those technologies we'll say more on when we advise government in May from the committee's point of view. But also we would encourage the Scottish Government to be working with the UK Government, the other kind of key energy bodies like Ofgem and the NESO to make sure you do that roll out as efficiently as possible with the best benefits to Scotland as possible. And then there are questions which are, again, outside of the committee's remit on what you do to make sure there is a maximum industrial benefit for Scotland in particular.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's the end of our questions. You'll be delighted to hear. But thank you very much for your contributions this morning. It's been genuinely very, very interesting. I'm sorry if it was a little bit rushed, but I'm afraid we're trying to hear as much as we possibly can. So thank you very much for cooperating with us on that. And we'll no doubt hear from you at some point again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, it's true. Welsh Railways.
Morning, everyone. If our panels have changed over very quickly, so thank you for that. And welcome to our second panel this morning. We're very much looking forward to hear what you have to say. And I am going to hand over to Harriet Cross.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I'll keep the first question relatively brief, and it's more to do with just the ambition and feasibility of the two government schemes for looking at the transition of the energy sector. And in your answer, if you could maybe refer to the NESO report as well, and just sort of your take on sort of how that plays into and what's that sort of how that sits beside the two plans of the two governments. Anyone can take that up.
I take that first. So I think both the Clean Power Action Plan and the subsequent plans are certainly achievable, ambitious, but definitely achievable. I think Scottish Government's plans and some of the core plans we've been looking for have been delayed for a little bit of time. So the Energy Strategy and Just Transition Plan was meant to be this big sort of unifying document, which has been an ongoing process. So we hope to see that really, really soon. From engagement around that, we did feel that it was ambitious again, but deliverable. I think where the rubber meets the road on this is around the next step, specifically from the NESO plan, which is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. So this is, the NESO plan sets out here are the things that we want to do and the key decisions that we need to take. The Spatial Energy Plan then sets out here's where we're going to build everything, or where we think everything needs to go and how we're going to work to deliver those things. That was co-commissioned by UK Government, Scottish Government and Welsh Government. So speaking to your earlier question as well around collaboration, that's quite a positive signal. And just from personal experience being involved in Scottish Government and NESO engagements through the Clean Power Plan process, the vibe has been broadly broadly positive. Definitely achievable, and it seems like there's practical working together. We'll find out for sure. This will all come out in the wash through the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, in our view.
Thank you. So, from your point of view, Scotland and UK are quite aligned at the moment. Are there places where they're diverging, or sort of are the two governments? Does it seem like we're working together? They're
certainly working together, but I think previous panel pulled out well that the just transition point in Scotland is a much bigger deal in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland than it is at UK level just now. I don't think it's miles away. I think the general tone of the conversation around the energy transition has been broadly positive about the need for social and economic value and benefit, the need to make sure that people aren't being unfairly harmed or penalised through that process. What we don't have, as was pulled out previously at the UK level, is a formal panel commission way of embedding that into policy making just now, and we would certainly like to see that be brought through. Not just because we think it's a good or a right thing to do, as I'm sure most of the people around the table would agree on behalf of their constituents, but also there's this crucial point that we can't get to net zero full stop if you don't have everyone with the ability to get to net zero within that process. So we would like to see that branched out as well. Good collaborative working on the nitty-gritty energy system stuff, but more broadly, that's something that we would like to see pulled across.
Thank you. And then just looking at, again, like the feasibility, just in terms of timescales, how, assuming we're looking at the 2030 as the sort of the immediate timescale for decarbonising the grid, and then obviously the 2050 longer stop, how feasible do they feel relative to the current plans?
They still feel feasible. I don't think there's any major concern. Again, a good acknowledgement that Clean Power 2030 in particular is an ambitious plan, and it doesn't necessarily lay out all the details for how to get to where we need to get to for 2030, but a general, I'm not going to say full consensus, but a general agreement that it can be done, and it's absolutely what we should be aiming for. I guess the only slight, not concern in terms of Clean Power 2030, but obviously the Scottish Government, pragmatically, you could argue, rolled back on the previous climate change commitment. I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing to be able to be pragmatic with that type of process, but it makes that net zero 2045 commitment all the more prescient, and it makes 2030 in the interim an important stepping stone to collaborate on to get there.
Thank you.
Can I add an overlay there, building on what Fraser's comments are? So Paul Leeuw, Robert Gordon's University. So yes, I like the ambition of the NESO plans and everything and the clean power. It's great. But it is about what sits behind it. What's the investment, what's the activity, what's the doability. And I'll give you a very practical example, is on the wind side. So currently there's about 15 gigawatts of offshore wind installed, plus or minus a bit. We want to get to over 50 gigawatts in a very short period of time. That is 35 gigawatts over 5-6 years. 6 gigawatts a year by my calculation. Yeah? So if you have an average kind of wind turbine, which is 15 megawatts, you'd install 400 wind turbines a year, just over one a day. We are not installing a wind turbine a day for the next 5 years. We're not having the plans, the activity to do that stuff. The same for substations, the same for cabling, the same for grid connections. The activity needs to back up the kind of ambition. So the plan is critical, delivery is critical, visibility is critical. That's what we look for. Nothing wrong with the ambition. It's turning ambition into investment, activity and reality. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, just to build on Paul's point. So Hannah Corbett from the Centre for Energy Policy at University of Strathclyde. Definitely the ambition is great, but we're going to be building a lot of stuff in a condensed timescale, and how does that sort of play out in terms of worker and skills shortages, which the first panel talked a lot about. How does that impact on businesses and households? How do we make the most of oil and gas supply chains? There's going to be a lot of demand and understanding where that demand is going to fall in terms of the worker and skills, not just the types of workers and skills we'll need, but whether we can fulfil that demand in terms of the demand that's going to be coming on the construction sector, and how that plays out with all the other infrastructure demands that will be placed, building schools, hospitals, etc. So I think the ambition is great, and certainly my impression, as Paul and Fraser have mentioned, is that there's a lot of coordination between the two governments, but that coordination now needs to extend to local government, needs to extend between NESO, Ofgem, GB Energy, and in terms of thinking about if there's so much coming on board at one time, how do we plan and sequence those projects to make the most and to manage the demand spikes for particular skills and construction? So I think that planning point is really important, and that's not just about spatial planning, that's about planning for how you time and sequence those projects to get them best sort of economic, but also community benefits, which we've been speaking about a lot this morning.
Thank you.
Lillian?
Is investment in clean power in Scotland keeping pace with the decline of the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, I'll have to pick it up. So my area specifically is offshore energy, includes oil and gas, offshore wind, carbon capture, storage and hydrogen. Let me give you a little bit more building on the previous panel, because I think context is everything, right? So if you look what's happening in the oil and gas sector, it peaked in production in 1999-2000, 4.5 million barrels a day. We are already down 75% kind of at the moment, right? So there is already a quarter of a century of decline. Decline is nothing new. We have been doing it. And the basin is actually very good at declining. The choice we now have for the basin is between managed decline, a managed and orderly decline, or an accelerated and not so orderly decline. That's really the choice we have in front of us. And the reason why this is hugely important is because if you look at the supply chain, up to 80% of the oil and gas supply chain can actually help to accelerate the renewable sector, particularly if you look at carbon capture and storage, or you look at hydrogen, it's 80%, if it's wind, it's about 60% of the supply chain can transfer straight away. The workforce, by our work, over 90% has transferability. So actually, managing the decline in the oil and gas industry allows you to accelerate the renewables agenda, the element we want. This is a hugely important conversation to get it right. It's not about the destination. Destination is clear, we need to get to net zero. It's how do you manage the journey in between? And this is why this is so hugely important. And what we see there is a Goldilocks zone. And the Goldilocks zone is really between now and the early 2030s, where we need to manage oil and gas decline and coincide the job decline, the supply chain decline, to actually go straight to the renewable sector. If we do it right, we have a fantastic opportunity. If we get it wrong, we're losing the supply chain, we lose the workforce, we lose the skills, and we end up importing more. So this Goldilocks zone is absolutely critical, and that's why this is really important. Now, why is it relevant? Is because actually a lot of the workforce is actually based in Scotland. Roughly half of the offshore energy workforce is based in Scotland, and that's a really important element to manage. If you don't get it right, actually see a real huge impact. So therefore it's really critical to get an alignment between these sectors to done really well. And that's, I think, is really important that we see this as an energy workforce rather than an oil and gas workforce and a wind workforce. In the end, the vast majority of people work for the supply chain. If you work on a vessel, you're completely agnostic if you're going to go to an oil and gas platform, putting a cable down, or you're putting a cable down for wind. This is a cable, it's on the vessel. The vast majority work in the supply chain. This is a supply chain management and skills conversation. And we have a choice to get it right. At the moment, we're not there yet.
Can I just add as well, I think just building on Paul's point about making the most of those oil and gas infrastructure and supply chains that really have embedded across the UK over the last half a century. I think there's real opportunities to, building on Paul what said, to take advantage of those and sort of capture UK competitive advantage in areas such as CCUS, where some companies are already reorientating activities. I think also just thinking about the coordination point, I mean, it's not just going to be oil and gas workers where potentially there might be job losses, but it's in other sectors such as retail and wholesale sectors, and how do those kind of job people get retrained? How do skills and training programs factor into that? And some of our researchers also looked at oil and gas capacity, perhaps labour jobs being freed up and looking to move to other sectors, but oil and gas production is still going to be continuing. So there's not necessarily going to be the oil and gas workers freed up capacity in sufficient quantities to service new industries, renewables, CCUS. So I think there's a real role for government in thinking about that coordination point about when skills and workers are available. How do you sort of tailor training programs, not just for those working actually in oil and gas, but in related supply chains who might be at risk of losing their jobs. Okay. And that's, I guess, is also as a just transition piece as well.
Okay, I think the other points have been answered then.
Okay. So it'd be you next, Leeuw.
Just on the back of some of the stuff that you were saying, I know that there's no any simple solution to the transition for jobs. What skills do you think that the workforce will need coming forward? And how would we encourage employers and investors to take that on? And also, what lessons should both governments learn from Grangemouth?
I'm happy to give it a go because we spent a lot of time on job skills. Can I start with the jobs, because I think it's really important.
Okay.
By my count, somewhere 67, 68 million people live in the UK, about 33, 34 million work. If you look at how many people support the offshore oil and gas industry and the wind industry and carbon capture and hydrogen, roughly 1 in 220 people working in the UK support the offshore energy industry, that is both onshore and offshore. In Scotland, if you do the same calculation, it's roughly 1 in 30. If you're sitting in the northeast of Scotland, where I live, and where Stephen lives, it's 1 in 5, and if you take the induced jobs, it's 1 in 3. So actually, there's a different conversation depending on where you sit in the country, what's happening. Now, if you look at the people currently working in the industry, and again, there's a direct, indirect, and induced jobs, but if you look at the jobs here, roughly half work in Scotland and the other half work in the rest of the UK. But most people currently in the industry actually operating platforms, operating terminals, operating pipelines. But the future of work isn't like that. The future of work is building things. You heard it in the previous panel, you heard it from my colleagues as well, is around building new wind farms, building new substations, building the grid. So we need a different type of workforce, and it's going to be far more kind of location-based, place-based, rather than in one element. So there's a very different type of work coming up with a different skills requirement. And that trick to manage that Goldilocks zone in a really smart way. Because actually, if you're HR, you can move from one industry to the other industry, it's HR. If you finance, it's finance. Procurement, supply chain is supply chain. Where this gets more challenging is around some of the more bespoke functions, technicians, operations, project managers, people with that kind of more technical background. And that requires very mindful mapping around this. What is the demand in one industry or decline demand in one industry, which the demand in other industries look like? So the role for the new Skills England, the new Skills Development School is really critical to make sure we understand what the demand picture looks like. If you know the demand picture of how many people you need and by when, then you can worry about the second part, is the supply, and then to think about what is the skills we need to meet that demand picture. Now, you heard earlier from Richard in the earlier panel, some really important thing is this also depends how much of the new activity we're going to execute in the UK by UK supply and workforce. If you look at the oil and gas industry in the last 50 years, roughly 25-30% of capital activity was executed by UK supply chain and UK workforce. If we do the same for wind and for carbon capture and storage for hydrogen, we're going to import a lot. A lot of the jobs will actually disappear to other countries for us to import the final product. So local content is going to be a huge part of what links into what the workforce we need, and then really what are the skills we need. Most skills we actually already have. Said 90% of the workforce is transferable from currently one sector to the others. Is how we use it, how we develop them. And training is measured in weeks and months, not measured in years. So we actually have all the ingredients for an incredible energy transition. We just need that well integrated planning, coordinated action to make it happen.
Can I add something on industry investment in skills training? I think also what's really important, we did some work with the industrial clusters in Scotland, HyNet, East Coast, which was looking at carbon capture and storage in particular, and the one of the recurring messages was around providing industry and business certainty, and that was about making final investment decisions. And with the example of CCUS, there's been some delay to those. We talked about the Scottish cluster example earlier. So I think that's really critical in terms of providing industry the level of certainty that then they invest in skills and training. Bigger companies investing, and that sort of ripples down the supply chain for them then to make the decisions about upskilling, retraining staff, so investing in skills programs. That's really important, and that's certainly a role for UK and Scottish governments.
Can I add in, just one final thought, is in terms of capitalising on that opportunity of the transition. One thing, in another proud northeasterner, Forfordland, with friends and family in the oil and gas industry, having done bits of work in the space as well, is that there's still no dedicated nationwide transition fund pipeline process. There's no one obvious place where this happens or service that you can point to. It's still quite complicated. It's still quite up and down and in and out. In a lot of cases, it's still self-funded to a certain point as well. So we could be a lot clearer on the opportunities and on those pipelines. And as Paul says, the role of, in particular, skills development in Scotland has increased over the years and is likely to only become more important. But I think if we want to add just another point onto this, is we're not just talking about oil and gas communities going into offshore wind. We've also got a massive heat transition coming up over the next more likely 20 to 25 years, if we're looking at sort of current timelines for that, which is also an inherently local problem, which also requires inherently local planning and solutions, because the buildings in this part of London are different to the buildings in Forfar, to the tenements in Glasgow. So these all require very localised action and planning as well as the transition plans for the North Sea, for Aberdeen, for Grangemouth and others. But how you then ramp up, what new skills do we need, what new people do we need to bring into the workforce longer term? Because while we discuss the 2030 timeline and even the 2045 timeline, this is a much longer perspective that we need to be taking to make sure, again, we learn the lessons of previous transitions and that we are geared up to capitalise on what is a big opportunity in front of us.
Kirstine, I think.
Thank you very much. And my question is for yourself, Fraser. I do appreciate your background in delivering Glasgow's first ever community energy project. So I'm going to ask you what role you think community ownership of energy assets can play in Scotland's path to net zero, and whether you think both UK and Scottish governments could and should be doing more to support community energy, and also what you think about the role that GB Energy could play in that sphere.
This is my favourite question. So community energy set up the Glasgow Community Energy Project. That was with a load of other incredible people. Community energy is an incredibly powerful thing, often in spite of a very challenging system that's weighted against it in terms of the policy support that's available, in terms of the previously mentioned lack of economies of scale. And also there's a lot of reliance on volunteers in the community energy sector to get projects off the ground. That can be a burden of 1 to 2 years, just to get to the point of having a feasible project that's ready to go. The role that I think community ownership, including shared ownership, where developers have their big projects, a community buys in either to share the revenue of that project or to take a full part ownership stake in that project. I think the role that has to play is threefold. First, there's immense social and economic value that comes from full ownership or shared ownership compared to just community benefit. It does a lot in terms of the majority of community energy organisations also have fuel poverty support arms within the work that they do. Plymouth Energy Community alone reached 11,000 people over the course of the energy crisis to provide support and to link them up with available government support and make sure everyone was claiming the things that they were due. We have other really good examples of places like Staffordshire, where Staffordshire Community Energy have worked with the local NHS trust to put solar panels on the buildings there, which directly funds the local fuel poverty charity, which does outreach to make sure that those most vulnerable and most harmed are supported, with a role to play through the transition. So I think this is the second point. The first, they bring a lot of social and economic value. They also create jobs in local areas. The second is engagement. They're often far more trusted as regular community members and organisations than, in a lot of cases, even local councils are at this point. So they have a good role to play within that space, particularly for reaching those groups that are typically excluded, particularly in the clean energy transition conversation. I think the third side of this, if we can be a bit cynical and political about it as well, is that with community ownership, with that value, you naturally build a more broad base of support for that overall clean power mission. Now, that's not to say that we should buy communities off with benefit or with ownership, but when communities have a stake in it, the perspective generally, not just within the community members involved in the project, but more widely in a community, tends to also be more positive, which means you can ultimately get more done more quickly, if that's part of your interest. So I think those three key roles is where we would see them having a role to play. On the final point, GB Energy, very quickly, we have a couple of support schemes here in Scotland, the Welsh Energy Service in Wales, and the Community Energy Fund covering England. I think where GB Energy can layer in, and the local power plan more generally is one in capacity building, still rely on volunteers, still broadly can't pay staff. The second is in the low-cost finance. So community energy projects tend to get grant money down to do their feasibility. They just about have a project ready, but then traditional finance won't touch them because they're seen as risky organisations, or, again, economies of scale, the projects are seen as too small. So GB Energy, in the interest of maximising public value from the energy transition, for my money, community and shared ownership should be high on their priority list for when they come to spend that local power plant money.
Thank you very much. Can I, Hannah and Paul, if they have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just perhaps the committee in further explanation around this issue. We're doing some work in Shetland looking at the impact of green energy development, so Sullom Voe terminal, other things, how they're going to impact on the economy and society there. And we went up back in September now, and there's a really interesting example in North Yell around community ownership of a wind farm. So because obviously you've got the Viking development on Shetland, which has an associated community benefit fund, so you've got the sort of shared ownership model, but then you've got sort of the community benefit. So I think perhaps that might be, and I'm happy to talk to the committee or one of the specialists to point them in the right direction of people that it might be worth talking to. I think as frameworks get developed for how communities benefit from different energy developments, I think there's a real crucial role for UK, Scottish governments, GB Energy to really coordinate around this to ensure that there's some sort of consistency and coherence between these different frameworks, which in the Scottish case are voluntary at the moment, and that creates some sort of level playing field as well, both for communities but also investment and industry players as well.
I'm just going to add a few things what Fraser and Hannah said. I think we need to be collectively very clear what we ask GB Energy to do. And again, because I think it's covering a huge range of activity. I think if we want to set it up for success, I'm sure they'll want to do it as well. We need to really well, clear, focus, defined agenda with deliverables, what they're going to do, because we ask them to sort out the energy system, we sort about the planning, the consenting, there's lots of things happening. I think we need to be really clear, what is the role of GB Energy in the next so many years? Where's the focus? So that we have clear expectations and no surprises and no disappointments either.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask the panel, is there an argument that switching from the single national wholesale market for electricity to several local markets would immediately cut electricity bills across Great Britain and most of all in Scotland? For instance, the electricity network balancing costs push bills up, where we pay curtailment costs, as I understand it, we pay local wind farms in Scotland at peak times to effectively stop producing energy. Surely regional or zonal pricing would drive down bills, and the most dramatic reductions in household bills could be in regions that have the most abundant clean power generation, such as Scotland. Surely we could have the cheapest bills in Europe if there was regional pricing.
Just a quick one on that, Douglas. I don't think I've got all the answers for you right now, but we're part of the UK Energy Research Centre, and there's going to be some research looking at that. So we're happy to keep in touch as the sort of findings emerge from that. I don't know if Fraser has.
Yeah, I'll wade in. So part of the, I think we understand the draw of locational pricing. I think it's important to be clear on what it would mean in practice in terms of the delivery of it. So as it stands, from the extensive sort of REMA consultations, which we still don't have decisions on, as we understand it, the earliest possible implementation of a zonal model of pricing would be 2032. That's current intel. So in terms of immediately reducing bills, there's not an awful lot that it can do in the short term. The challenge that it poses, and while I sympathise particularly as someone interested in Scottish energy and Scottish consumers, while I sympathise entirely with the argument, there's still no real clarity on what potential models of locational, zonal, nodal pricing would be coming forward. I think it did start to narrow down towards the end of the REMA consultation process, but there's no decision being released on that formally yet. That's actually having a bit of an adverse impact in terms of investors and developers are holding back final investment decisions in renewables, which we hope can bring down bills in the shorter term until they know exactly what the outcome is, because they have a current market regime, and then if that potentially goes under fundamental overhaul, that can completely change their business plan for 5, 10, 15 years. So I think what's crucial about this, and while there are arguments both sides of it, it's if you've been across the debate, as I'm sure some members of the committee have, it's been a very confrontational debate in many, many ways. I think the critical thing here is that government takes the decision on REMA, publishes that with as much detail as they can possibly give, because we cannot afford, as we've said already, we cannot afford to stall investment further on the 2030 timeline. 2032 locational, it's almost a sort of an academic discussion at this point. It's post-2030. There are things that should be and need to be implemented in the meantime that will better serve 2030, but also better serve households and people struggling with bills today.
Can I make 2 additional comments? The first thing is, I think it would be maybe quite interesting for all of us, and I did it this morning, to look at your utility bill and look what your gas bill is and what your electricity bill is. Because if you, by my bill, currently I pay about 26 pence a kilowatt hour for electricity and about 6 pence a kilowatt hour for gas. Actually, electricity is 4 times more expensive than gas. And if you use gas to generate electricity, you kind of question what's happening. And the reason it happens is because there's quite a lot of charges in our electricity system what's going to go towards the consumer. That is transportation, there's charges, the charges for policy, green charges, all coming to the consumer. And of course, when you think about it, we built the new grid, replumb, rewire, and repurpose the electricity system, and we don't kind of load that back into the consumer, because we end up, what we do now, is that our electricity price is 4 times as high as a gas price per pence per kilowatt hour. And that's a really quite interesting one, because actually that is really not makes any sense. And then the second question is, of course, we have a national system of electricity to move. Other countries have regional elements, which doesn't actually go anywhere, just doesn't connect to the grid. So there's other ways of doing it. And I think as we design the future of our energy system, actually absolutely national systems critical, backbone superbly important, but there are other ways of doing it where we're saying that there might be regional community elements where we do this, where there's a benefit to the community, do it in a very different way. But have a look at your utility bill, because again it is really quite insightful what actually makes up the cost of what you have, and actually it might actually get under the skin of what the issues really are.
Just add one last note on that as well. I think that's a good point. There are other ways to do it, and there are ways just now that we send locational signals through the energy market. So those network charges are one of them, particularly when it comes to investment. The use of the transmission network is massively high in Scotland because we've got lots of wind up there, lots of people are using the network, so you're trying to shift people to think about plugging in different places. That's also causing delays for developers because it's too high, blows a hole in the side of the business case as they see it. I think there's a point that's been raised a couple of times around curtailment, which is an interesting point, an important point. Emma Pinchbeck picked up that building transmission is the best way to deal with that for curtailment across the board. But headlines have been dominated by paying wind farms to turn down. 76% of curtailment payments go to gas generators, not to wind turbines. So there's a more complex picture at play there. All of it points to the need to build more, get renewables online, but also think about those configurations of the market that ultimately pass value on to consumers at a critical juncture in socio-technical history of this country.
Thank you. Angus.
I'm loving this whole conversation. What happens internationally? So Denmark, 20% of renewables are owned by the community, I understand. And in Helgoland in Germany, they have 3 offshore wind farms, which generates more for the community there than all the community benefits for Scotland as a whole in 2023. Do you think that we can learn from what's happening internationally and make that happen in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is absolutely. I think what we're doing is we're replicating a model we had, which has been very successful for decades, right? And again, I think, but the world of energy is different. It's far more distributed, it's far more place-based, it's far more localized, and it's very different characteristics. Everything is going to connect it because our cars, our house, gadgets, everything is going to be connected to the system. So we need to make sure it works, that there's a backup, that we always have energy security, and we can make sure the whole system is okay. But yeah, there's a very different ways of doing it, and have distributed energy in a way where we haven't done before. So there are great models out there, there are great ways of doing it, but I think that we need to require careful planning. We still need the big kind of the motorways to make sure we can move the electrons around the country, but we also need to think about actually not every community needs a motorway and need that kind of solution. So there are different solutions for different problems at different points in time. Island communities can do it very differently, and we've seen very successful examples around the world where that happens.
Anna, did you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if it's... I think there's also interesting international comparisons and examples in terms of just transition, and also sort of industrial transitions. And the committee might be interested, or might have already been to the Michelin Scotland Innovation Park in Dundee, which is a sort of public-private partnership, repurposing the Michelin tire factory, which happened over a number of years. So that sort of planned activity, and now has a skills academy based on it, which is training people to service heat pumps, electric vehicles, etc., but also hosting spaces for start-ups to innovate sustainable products, all sorts of different activities, and was done, as far as I understand, in consultation and close collaboration with the community. So I think there's also examples at a European EU level, but in France and Italy, about looking at kind of understanding skill supply and how that can be matched with the kind of available candidates. And I think we mentioned Denmark before flexi security, so using the social security system in terms of supporting retraining and reskilling. So I think the international landscape also has some interesting sort of just transition learnings.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions to you this morning. It was very, very interesting. So thank you very much for coming along, and no doubt we'll be in touch at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.